Hello everyone, this is GM Josh Friedel, and today I'll be doing another entry into my Autopsy series. For those of you who haven't seen these videos before, basically what I do is I break down a particular game or sometimes a position from the losing side, the side which made some errors. And the idea is to figure out how people lose games and how, when we face these kind of decisions in our own games, how to improve on it and to try to get inside their mindset a little bit, but mostly just, if we get a similar situation, how do we improve and how do we avoid making game losing mistakes? So it's a little different than just analyzing games because when we analyze, we're just trying to find, the objective truth of the position. We talk about practical matters and stuff like that. But really, in this, we're really trying to figure out not only what the mistakes were move wise, but why they were made and what causes our losses. In my opinion, it's a very important way to improve is not just to analyze your games and figure out what your mistakes were, but to figure out why you made them. So that's kind of what we're going to focus on today. So I was kind of inspired by the recent US Championship, and I took a game from the US Women's Championship between GM Irina Krush and Jennifer Yu. Now, for those of you who weren't following the tournament, Jennifer posted a score of 10 out of 11. Absolutely incredible, and basically just demolished everyone. Gave up a couple of draws along the way, but really just ran away with the tournament. Irina had a very difficult result. I think she ended with 50%, which, or maybe even -1, but by her standards, a very, very poor tournament. And of course, when we're having a poor event, and this is something to kind of remember, it's easy to make a lot of mistakes. So you don't want to analyze your mistakes from a poor event too closely because a lot of them are, you're not mistakes you normally make. And if you try to identify a pattern out of them, it's not really meaningful. But one of the things I have noticed when I'm playing badly is that the typical mistakes I make get magnified. So a lot of the times I have the same weaknesses, but because I'm not as informed, because I'm not feeling well, whatever the reason I'm playing badly is, and believe me, you can come up with lots of them. But essentially, it means that whatever you normally do not so well or what your weaknesses are get pronounced. So it's definitely something to keep an eye on for this game. And again, like Jennifer, her performance was really impressive to me. Not just because, okay, if you get great positions every single game, it's still hard to get 10 out of 11, But I would say, including in this game, Jennifer got lots of unfavorable positions. And one of the things that impressed me most was that regardless of what position she got, she played it as well as she could play it. And basically, when it came to crunch time, when it came to moments in the middle game where it was complicated, or say where neither side had lots of time, she would play better than her opponents pretty much every time. And that's how she ended up with such an incredible score. But in general, I find it useful to look at someone's games when they have a performance like that. Rather, it doesn't matter whether it's Magnus or Jennifer or someone else, It's when they have a beastly score like that, I like to look at their games to kind of see what they're doing and what causes their opponents all these problems. So anyway, that's enough of an intro, I think. We can get to some chess. So Irina chooses the English. She plays d4, c4, knight f3, not too much e4, but basically any form of d-pawn opening she can play. c6, e4. So I would say that this is a trick that GMs use a lot. Because a lot of players play the Slav with c6, d5 against d4, but they do not play the Caro-Kann. So, of course, Irina doesn't usually play it either, but it's one of those things where she doesn't play it as white, I should specify. She does play it as black, but it's one of those things where GMs like to do this to people because it gets a lot of people out of their comfort zone. They want to play Slav. They don't want to play Caro. And even though it's a particular variation of the Caro with c4, it's not something that every Slav player likes. So this is a very, very common move order trick. And if you do play the Slav, I would recommend either learning the lines that occur in the game after d5 and how to play these positions, or learn one of the other systems against c4. There are so many good ones. c5, symmetrical is good. e5 is good. Knight f6 is not a bad move. And after knight f3, you can play into Slav if that's your thing. But after knight c3, c6 is not really a recommended move because of e4. Again, I don't like to talk about the opening too much, but just if you do play the Slav, you should be aware of how to handle this. And here you can also play e5, transposing to those lines. You could play e6 is a move, although it may not be your repertoire. And d5 if you like Grunfeld type positions. But I would say that in general, learning e5 or c5 is worth your while, because you want to be able to play a normal system against the English. In any case, c6, e4 is what happened, d5, and d4. So they're actually playing a Panov now. A lot of people like to take this pawn, and it goes into in a pawn sack line after queen a4 check usually, knight bd7, knight c3, and eventually black usually will win this pawn back. And you get kind of a typical isolated pawn position. These positions I find quite interesting, actually, and perfectly fine for black. But Irina chose a Panov, which used to be more popular than it is now, but it's still a system with some sting. So knight f6, knight c3. So there's a big divergence between e6 and knight c6. I'd say e6 is the slightly more solid move. Knight c6 leads to more combative positions, and it also leads to a forced endgame, which occurs after knight f3. If you guys are really curious, I'm sure you can look all that stuff up. But Irina chooses bishop g5, which is a more combative move. Actually, when I used to play the Panov, which feels like over 10 years ago, long time, I used to play the system as white, because it is very interesting, but I would say it's definitely on the risky side, because, I mean, look at it, you haven't developed your king side yet, and your center is a little loose, but it's definitely an interesting line. I ended up getting killed by Wang Hao in a World Cup, in like one of those knockouts, and it really turned me off the whole opening. But it doesn't mean, of course, that it's a bad system. Anyway, bishop g5, bishop e6, which is a perfectly good move. So it looks a little weird, but the idea is you want to support d5, and you don't want to play e6 walking into a pin. So these positions, there are so many moves. Irina plays a3, which looks like a ridiculous move. But it's actually a very common thing, because you want to control the b4 square, you want to be ready to play c5. And black can never really take, because now you can simply do this and win a piece. So very common. So queen d7, black wants to try to support her center. Bishop e2, which again looks like a strange move, but this is often how the system is played. Because now you have the option of playing c5, you have the option of playing bishop f3 next. There are lots of subtleties in these kind of positions which you have to become aware of, but anyway, we're not going to talk about those for now. Rook d8. So finally white takes this knight. Jennifer takes with the e-pawn, and now c5. So we reach a position where basically on the queen side, white's doing great. White has basically just a free extra pawn, has extra space, and is just going to launch queenside pawns. Black has an extra pawn on the king side, but it's doubled, so it's hard to do a lot with. However, black definitely has some ideas here, which is black can try to push a lot of these pawns, and black also has the two bishops, which can come in handy in some positions, and potentially a weakness on d4, if black's bishop and knight and other pieces can really target this guy. So, to me, it's just a very unclear position. Black played g6, which is a fairly normal move, trying to develop the bishop. So white has options. Knight f3, bishop f3 are both fine. We'll stick to what Irina chooses, which is, I think it's a new move, but it's certainly a very logical one, which is knight f3, developing a piece. You could argue that bishop f3, knight e2 is more secure and maybe allows for knight f4, but at the same time I like that this bishop can influence the queen side, so I really don't mind it. And also her move is one tempo faster, which is something I always appreciate. When you look at piece arrangements, looking at how long it takes to reach them is a good idea, because knight f3 you get one move, bishop f3, knight g2 takes two moves. People always forget that for some reason. Anyway, so here Jennifer plays a move which I'm not as crazy about. I would probably just play bishop g7. And honestly, life just kind of continues here. White can play b4, for example. In general, allowing b5 and allowing white to dominate so easily is not a good idea, so you can play a move like a6. So white can always play b5, and it's not some horrible move, but the problem is after takes castles, your pawn structure is broken up, so you're no longer just murdering black on the queen side, which doesn't seem like a big deal, but it means that it's going to be more challenging to just overrun black here. I would say that black will have lots of counterplay. Not that it's unplayable, of course. So oftentimes white will castle, say, and then try to play with a4 and b5. So again, notice how it's about the tempi. The reason you play a6 is not necessarily because you want to just prevent this advance, but because it takes white an extra move now to prepare. Because of course, white if white could play after a6, a4, then it wouldn't do anything except open the queen side, which is usually bad. But here, because a4 is not playable due to this pawn hanging, when you get to this position, you have to play rook b1, a4. So again, it's a matter of tempi. It costs white an extra tempo to get in b5. And here, black can try counterplay, for example, a move like bishop f5, forcing the rook to a weird square, bishop e4, and then maybe f5, trying to target this pawn. And again, I think the position's quite unclear. I think that either side could claim to have a decent position. But Jennifer chose a more combative move, you could say. She played h5. So she makes her intentions perfectly clear. She wants to play on the king side, which is not necessarily bad, but I would say that h5 is extremely committal, and I like the option of getting castled. I would say that castling as black, even though it's a slightly odd position, is still a decent way to play. And I don't like that her move does not contribute towards castling. But at the same time, it's a nice aggressive move. b4 was played, which I think is quite reasonable. Bishop to h6. It's unclear to me how strong the bishop is here. In some ways, I like it better on g7, but at the same time, it definitely isn't a bad square. The problem is that now Irina gets in b5 kind of for free, because now there's no a6, there's none of that. And knight a5 is playable, but is of course a little risky, and your knight might get stranded. She chooses knight e7. And here is a move which I kind of disagree with, and I think is not, again, the cause of her loss, but is definitely kind of a move which to me indicated she was not quite sure how to play here. So, especially in the interview after, I find them very telling, and one of the things I noticed, I happened to catch that one, and one of the things she said was that she was clearly really optimistic about her opening. She thought she was close to winning here. And while I don't think that claiming an advantage here is unreasonable, you still have to be very, very careful about how you play it. So a move like h4 to me is very strange strategically, and the main reason is because you're really playing on black's side of the board. So one of the most common rules when you're playing on opposite wings is you usually, unless it's an extremely restrictive move for your opponent, you don't want to play on their side. So a move like a6 is logical because it slows white down. h4 was maybe designed for the same purpose, but the fact is that this pawn can become quite a weakness in a lot of cases. Say if black plays bishop g4, knight f5, all of a sudden this pawn becomes loose, and I think that giving black this kind of weakness is not really the way to play here. So I really expected her to castle, and it looks weird castling into a pawn assault, but the fact is that her king's not going anywhere else, so you might as well get castled. g5, that's the other thing, h4 makes castling much more awkward, and you really have to castle here, because your king's not going to stay in the center. And here, if it were me, I would probably play a move like knight e1. This is kind of a standard type move, you get the knight out of the way of the push, black can push either pawn really, and then you have all sorts of options. But basically, the idea is you let your opponent come to you. If you try to go out to meet your opponent, they're going to be at your door quicker. So usually you actually want to lay back and wait for them to do it. So it looks like a strong attack. But I'll even go further, because I want to show you that there are always ways to deal with attacks like this. For example, let's say white plays super greedy. It just plays a4, which, by the way, is not a bad move. If you think that you don't have too many great defensive moves, oftentimes it's a sign that you should just play on your better side of the board. So a4, g4, which makes sense, knight back to e1, so you get a similar position. It could get to something like this, playing the way I would play. Again, I tend to be a little bit more frightened of attacks like this than a lot of players are, so I'd be trying to defend a little bit, but at the same time, you want to make sure your defensive moves have purpose, right? So knight e1 definitely has one, so let's say h4. And again, she didn't do this, but this is maybe something she was slightly worried about, and she's like, why should I deal with this? But the fact is that black, you're trying to push your pawns, but you're not really doing that much, believe it or not. So if white makes a mistake and flinches and plays on black's side of the board, then there are problems. For example, you take, you don't allow bishop e3 check, so you play hg, and then f5, f4 comes and hits you, maybe with knight g6 if you need to, and all of a sudden it's like, whoa, my king's getting slaughtered. How'd this happen? It happened because you pushed your pawn. You allowed your opponent to open you up. Let's even say white completely ignores black. Now, I should point out, this is a completely obnoxious move. I'm not suggesting this is a great move. What I am suggesting is that sometimes doing nothing is a better defense. For example, now if g3, if a move like f5, incidentally, you have this resource of playing f4, which is very common. And the idea is that now if you allow me to play knight d3, I'm very solid. If g3, I can play h3. If h3, I can play g3. You can't open me up. And if you take, all of a sudden I have plenty of options. Even rook takes f3 looks reasonable to keep your bishop out. And basically, I'm very well defended over here all of a sudden. So ideas like f4 can be very strong. So g3 is the most combative move. But now I can even just ignore you again. This isn't quite an ignore you move because I'm controlling the e3 square, which is very important. I don't want the bishop to land there. And the question is, what can black even do? You can take on h2, then I simply play king h1. Again, you have no way of opening me up over here. And my idea is that basically, okay, do all you want over here. If you do not checkmate me or achieve something great on the king side, you will lose on the queen side. It may not be immediate. It may take several moves, but you will lose over there. There is nothing on this earth that will prevent black from losing on the queen side. It's really like a King's Indian attack in that sense. That if black cannot achieve something great over here, white will be pretty much winning on the queen side. And white could try a move like h3, but then even just fg. If takes, you can even just move your rook. Sacking the exchange isn't completely idiotic, but is probably pointless. And what's black doing? It's really quite a position because it looks like you're just completely being obnoxious and annoying black's attack. But the fact is, as you can see, black's attack is not that crushing. So I really think that there are times when you want to slow your opponent down, but it's important to realize when you just have to let them come to you. And in most opposite wing attack positions, I would say that any move on their side of the board, meaning the side of the board they're playing on, is a very risky move and should be made with caution. Even black playing a move like b5 has to be made cautiously. It's less cautious because your king's not over there. So you can play moves on their side of the board a little more often when you don't have a king there. But because your king is going to go to the king side, you're not going to head over here to the queen side. That's not a good idea. So because you're going to stay over here, you really want to keep those pawns at bay if you can. So one of the reasons why people talk so much about hooks, like a pawn on h3, a pawn on h4 is also a hook. And it's like basically a way for your opponent to get at you. If you do not give them those kind of pawns, it's so much harder. So I think that this was just a really poor approach. And I think it was based on the fact, and again, I could be completely wrong. I can't get inside someone else's head. But I think it's largely based on the fact that she thought her opponent should have almost no counterplay and that she was basically winning on the queen side. And while it's true on the queen side she should win eventually, it's to allow your opponent zero counterplay is a very rare thing. And a move like h4 will actually ensure that black always has play over here. So Jennifer played king f8. And again, I still didn't mind castling. The old-fashioned person to me. But basically, I want to castle, put my rook on e8, bishop g4, knight f5. I think black has decent counterplay in general. But okay, king f8, king g7. So once again, I kind of like castling. And the main reason is because I don't think g5 at the moment is a big deal, because you can always play takes and knight e5, and the knight on e5 is actually extremely strong. And one of the advantages of having a pawn on h4, it's not all drawbacks. So I don't know. I might have liked castling, but okay, she played a5. She decided to play the obnoxious way, we can call it. Basically saying, you got nothing. And here I really think that Jennifer's position's fine, but I think that actually, sort of like Irina, she actually panicked in the opposite way. Like Irina thought her position was killing here, which I'm not so sure I agree with. Whereas Jennifer probably thought she was in trouble. And in that case, she played a rather defensive move in a position where I'm not quite sure she has to. Like black, for example, can play this move bishop g4. And again, I'm not entirely certain what white's doing here. If white were already castled, moving the knight is more of an option. But because you're not castled yet, it's kind of difficult. You can play a move like castles now, but then I play knight f5, and all of a sudden all your pawns are loose. I have clear counterplay. I'm not saying that the position's horrible for white, but I don't see why black should be in any kind of trouble here. I think black has loads of counterplay. So I think that this would have been a much better option for Jennifer. She played knight c8. And I would say that this position also, again, while I don't know if Irina's move is terrible, it's definitely, I think, the wrong approach. So these are kind of moments which we run into a lot, and I would say that oftentimes we don't play them correctly. And I'm using we literally. I mean, I've made this kind of mistake too many times to count, but it's still one which I really try to watch and, make sure I avoid, which is your opponent plays a move which you view as passive. There's no way Irina saw knight c8 and was scared. She's like, all right, knight c8, I'm in it now. Now I've got it going. But the fact is that oftentimes when your opponent plays a slow move like this, it means they don't have a good idea. And it means that that's the time you slow down. You play castles, you improve your pieces, and later try to break through on the queen side. I think that a lot of the times when people see a move that's a backtracking move, they try to rush. But the fact is that if you try to rush them down, then sometimes their move comes in handy. Other times they still can create counterplay. But if you all of a sudden just start improving your position while they're backtracking, when they backtrack, they basically tell you, I don't see a good way to have counterplay, so I'm going to play defensively. If they're doing that, slowly improve your pieces. If they're not going to threaten you, then just improve your pieces, slowly, make your position nice, play castles and rook e1, just make your position that much nicer. And if Jennifer's not going to do anything, if she's going to put her knight on c8, and I don't know what the follow-up would be, then I think that you can take your time in winning on the queen side. Because again, eventually you will win there, but you do not have to be in a hurry. She chose b6, which I actually like a lot less. First of all, because I think it's very committal, but also, again, I think that just castling and keeping the pressure on would have been a much nicer choice. So Jennifer chooses a6, and now knight a2. So Irina could have forced a queen trade maybe with a move like queen a4, and this would have been, I think, a nice option. I don't think the endgame is that easy to win. Because this committal move b6, if black can blockade on c6, it's not super easy to win. I'm not saying that it's not going to win eventually in a lot of cases, but in general, an endgame's nice, because then you don't have to worry about getting mated on the king side so much. And if black tries to avoid it with a move like queen e7, you could play c6, but even if you just castle, I think that black's in trouble because this knight on c8 is just horrible now, because the queen, it can't get out. The queen on e7 is very badly placed. You could also think about just c6, and it might be a pretty decent try. But in general, I think forcing the queens off would have been a really nice move. Instead, she just chose to play very directly, knight a2. But the problem with this move is that now Jennifer has time to fix her mistake. She plays knight e7, and now this knight is actually very nice because it controls this key square. Whereas if the pawn were left on b5, this wouldn't really be the case. So I think that this approach was actually incorrect because it gave Jennifer a chance to correct her error. And one of the things I noticed with Jennifer that was really good in this tournament was that it's not that she didn't make errors. Every chess player makes errors. It was that she didn't mind, admitting her error. She didn't mind going back. She didn't mind, okay, now I'm worse, now I'm going to fight. No matter what kind of position she got, she would continue to play it pretty well. And if she had a position she had trouble with and was maybe making mistakes, she would still, she wouldn't basically go into a downward spiral, which is really easy to do. So even though she put her knight on c8, which I think is a really poor decision, she now is like, okay, well, now I better improve it. And she doesn't have problems admitting her error and moving backwards, which is a very nice quality to have. And again, it's not a trait all chess players possess. So knight b4 was played. So again, she chooses a move which I think is a little too passive and does not achieve enough. Like, again, I think that playing for counterplay is so essential when you have a position which you could call strategically in the long term is lost. Whenever you're getting completely killed on one side, especially if you're down a pawn, you usually have to create counterplay of some sort. So I'm a big fan of bishop f5, maybe to e4. Again, knight f5 at some point is possible. And try to either take on h4 or put some pressure on white center, but basically counterplay. You need counterplay when your opponent is just murdering you on one wing. She chose queen c8, which again I just view as too passive. So as you guys can probably imagine, I would castle here. But Irina was feeling a little fancier. Rook a3, moves like this you have to be careful of, because sometimes they look like, it looks like an improving move because she wants to play rook c3, she wants to improve her pieces, but in some cases they rely on too many things to be good, and sometimes it doesn't really work out. So I don't know. I would again, I think that you have to castle at some point. You should just do it. And all right, so rook d8 was played, rook c3, And again, I think Jennifer should play actively. A move like bishop g4, again, I like. Because c6 immediately is actually very difficult to play. For example, c6, and now you can see that this rook on c3 is not so great, because you can even be super obnoxious, take and play rook e6, and this knight can't move because queen takes rook check, so you just take this knight. Again, this is something very easy to miss during a game, but the fact is that because white's pieces are so awkward, you should really seek to create that kind of immediate counterplay. Because again, you're going to lose on the queen side. Trying to jam it up is, in a middle game in particular, is really a difficult thing to do. But she tries. She plays bishop d7, and then bishop c6. So once again, and I think that this is, a difficult thing to do. Like when you have a position that's you believe is so good, and for sure Irina thought she had a great position. And in this position, like who could argue with her? This bishop on c6 is super passive. She's achieved a lot on the queen side, even if it's hard to break through. But the fact is that, again, her opponent played a move which is fairly passive, bishop c6. So in my opinion, when that happens, it's often the time, all right, now I slow down. It doesn't mean, all right, rush them down. It means that, okay, now is the moment where I should have just improved. So again, I like rook e1. I like improving my rook, getting it onto a better square. Say black plays knight f5, which is a logical move. Okay, bishop d3. I'm going to put pressure on this knight. Playing g5 is not realistic if I can take and put my knight into e5. If, I have to, I'll even play rook c2 to e2, just to challenge the e-file. But notice how I'm playing slower. I'm basically slowing down, I'm limiting black's counterplay, and making it so that, black's really feeling these passive pieces, because if black can't do anything, if I just improve my position slowly, my opponent can do nothing. And eventually, I am going to win this game. It may take a long time, but we're not in a hurry, right? And I think the problem was that Irina really wanted to shoot her down on the queen side. And in my opinion, she chose a move which I really don't like, which is knight e1. Now, this move is not objectively that terrible. Like, I really think that this is not what cost her the game. This is not the game-losing move. But this is a move, if I were her, I would really look at carefully. Because to me, if you leave the knight on f3, black can do nothing to you. g5 never works. The knight on f5 is completely controlled by the knight on f3. If you just improve your other pieces and go about your business slowly, I think that you win with, I would say, very little counterplay. Whereas after this, all of a sudden, because you're abandoning your king side with one of your pieces, you give Jennifer the chance to really create counterplay. And that's something which she does very well. She may get a bad position, but the second you let her in the game, she's very, very quick to pounce on it. So knight f5 was played. I would even think about knight back. I know it looks horrible, and no one's going to really play this, but I actually think her position is still pretty good. Bishop d3 next. Okay, slow. But okay, no one can blame her for not playing that. She took on c6, which is also fine. Queen takes, knight c2. But she has to sack this pawn, right? And I think she's correct to sack the pawn now. But the fact is that there was no reason to, right? The knight on f3 covered everything. So, again, she's giving, chances to her opponent, and this is an opponent who definitely did not need that many chances to get things done in this event. But just in general, you give your counterplay when they're playing passively is not something I like to do. So knight b4, queen e6. So here, again, I think she got a little greedy. Like, I like bishop f3, hit this pawn. If black wants to play passively rook d8, so be it. Probably they take, though. But what I like now, and you'd love to play queen takes f3, but bishop d2, skewering is a problem because you don't want your rook to end up on b4. That's pretty nasty. So you just take with the rook. But the nice thing is that once your opponent gives away their knight, it's much harder to create lots of play. You can target this pawn, you can play for c6, and black just doesn't have that many active pieces. So I think that this is at least a very safe position where you can just press. Bishop d3 is almost like, I don't even want you to be able to take my bishop, which to my mind is a little greedy. Bishop f4. And again, this is where things kind of started to cascade against her. Now, she didn't have tons of time here. I'm pretty sure neither player did. So it's hard to... I don't like to judge people too harshly for time pressure mistakes. And as far as learning from them goes, you can learn to not get into time pressure as easily. You can learn how to play more practically in time trouble. But it's very difficult. And, you don't want to judge your mistakes that harshly in time trouble. What you want to judge is what led you to trouble. And how you handle the trouble when it gets there is a different skill almost entirely. So in this position, she plays c6, because basically she's, again, in that mode of, all right, I have to do something immediately. But once again, I think that when your pieces are awkward, when things are a little weird, like this bishop on d3, knight on b4, rook on c3, none of them go together. They just don't make sense to me. So I really like the move bishop c2, and the idea is that you still cover this f5 square, but now your rook can participate in the defense. It looks like a nicer rook now. If black does nothing, you put the bishop on d3. And it's very hard for black to ever do anything. I mean, what is black going to do? Say if knight f5, you can even play rook f3, and you have a nasty skewer. Because black does not want to allow bishop takes knight and having to take with the pawn. That's a disaster. Black can try a move like g5, but now I play bishop b3, and that d5 pawn is going to be very sad. And also notice, if you get to take this pawn with the bishop, then you're actually defending and attacking at the same time, which is something I really love. So maybe black should even play a move like rook d8. But now you say, okay, I'll improve my rook. Maybe next you can try to improve your bishop, try to target this pawn. You have so many options, and the fact is, because your pieces go together, it makes it so black's counterplay is so much harder to find. And notice how, again, you're not rushing. Maybe you'll play c6 next move. Maybe you'll play it in 5 moves. Maybe almost never. Maybe you'll just win this pawn and win this pawn and just queen later, you know? The point is that you need to have coordinated pieces in order to limit your opponent's counterplay. And I think that if you're in too much of a rush, and again, Irina was short on time, it's an easy thing to do. But if you're in too much of a rush when your pieces are disorganized, that's a leading cause to allowing either counterplay or getting a lost position or something like that. So here c6 was played, bishop d6. And then people were really critical of Irina's exchange sack with rook c5 here. I think it's a poor idea. But not because you're sacking the exchange. I actually think that if you sack the exchange in a different way, for example, knight c2, pawn takes, rook takes, just allowing bishop h2 check. Oops, I blundered, right? But you look at this position and you see, okay, out of play knight, no real attack. This knight is able to get in the game either knight b4 trying to win a pawn here, or even knight e3 if I have to be more defensive. And I have a really nice queenside structure with a connected passed pawn. I would say that white is not worse here. Now, is white better? I don't know. Probably not. But it's an interesting game, and nothing really is happening too bad. So an exchange sack like that I like. Even knight takes a6. Oops. Just pitching this piece and playing c7 is not completely ridiculous. I don't know if white quite has enough here, but I would say that it's at least playable. She chooses rook c5, and the problem with this exchange sack is not that you're sacking the exchange, but that you end up with a knight that's on a6. So this is kind of the key, that, you know, sacrificing the exchange is a really common defensive and offensive tool, and it's definitely something which I think is a good idea. What I didn't like is that now she has an out-of-play knight in addition to it. So she's basically almost down a rook. And even if your pawns are completely monstrous, because you have no defense over here. Notice how in all those other positions, white had so much defense on the king side. Now there's nothing, which allows Jennifer to basically take over that wing, and you'll see that black's play is so much stronger. And here Jennifer just plays super well. Queen e5, knight c7, rook e7, and the problem now is that you can just take this knight almost at any time, and your position is just quite good. So queen a4 hitting the knight on h4, queen g5, knight f3 check, knight e1 check, so now she has to sacrifice another exchange. And again, sacrificing this position at first looks unclear. But the reason why it's so winning for black is because of white's king. And notice how it just got abandoned by all her pieces. So again, when you're in time pressure, it's so easy to make mistakes like this. But the fact is that you have to be so careful of trying to push too hard on your wing when your opponent can create counterplay. Oftentimes, killing their counterplay should be your first priority, with the knowledge that in the long term you will win on that wing. But because she rushed it a little bit too hard, all of a sudden, white's king is weak and it's just getting surrounded. So the game ended pretty abruptly. Queen f4, queen g4, which is a nasty move. The idea being that if you trade, I'm threatening just to play rook e(h1) and just mate you. And there's nothing much you can do. So f3 was played instead. And here, Jennifer could have even traded and played h4, and this pawn's going to be actually just too strong, because you can keep checking the king with the rook. But she played queen d7, which is fine as well. and Irina just resigned because there's no way your pawns are actually not getting there, and I'm gonna play h4 at some point and just break you open, and it's pretty much hopeless at this point. So once they made time control, Irina gave it up. So again, a really tough loss, and it's one of those things where when you're not playing well, losses like this happen so much more easily. And you don't want to look at them too critically as in, all right, this is some horrible weakness that I have, underestimating my opponent's play or whatever it is. But the fact is that once in a while, you'll see that when you're struggling, when you're not feeling as well in playing, when you're just not on your game, that's when weaknesses that you already have will be pronounced. So one of the things I would really look for from White's perspective is, okay, how did I get into trouble from, a pretty nice position? So part of it, I think, overestimating your position, thinking too low of your opponent's play is very risky all the time. But also, I think just the general approach of really feeling like she had to win immediately on the queen side. Because as we saw, if she keeps control over the center, if she gets castled, if she gets her pieces to good squares, Black's attack's not that terrifying. It really isn't. And I think that if you play, you obviously want to play on your wing on the queen side. But if you take your time and then make sure you kill your opponent's play whenever possible, and only on moves where you don't think you can do much to limit your opponent's play, then you advance on your wing. And I think that she tried to advance when her pieces were not ideal, when she still was behind over there. Because the queen side, the problem is you don't checkmate when you break through, right? It's the same thing in King's Indian a lot of the time. You're not checkmating yet. So you have to make sure your opponent doesn't get their play, because their play your king's over there. You got to be extra careful. And I would say that because Irina didn't do this, that's probably what caused this loss ultimately. And this was the third round, and after this, Jennifer just didn't stop going. So clearly she gained a lot of confidence from winning a position like this against an opponent who clearly has more experience in these positions as well. So I really can't stress enough how impressive that result is. But definitely, as we can see, this is a loss that, if you take more precautions, sometimes can be avoided. In any case, I hope you guys enjoyed this video. And once again, if you haven't checked out Jennifer's games from the tournament and the tournament in general, I would really recommend it. Both the Open and the Women's Tournament had a lot of interesting games that I'm definitely going to check through more of them closely myself. And otherwise, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you want to check out what's going to happen in future videos and maybe support the page, you can check out my Patreon, which I'll include a link below the video. And otherwise, just subscribe the video if you enjoyed it. So thank you, and see you next time.